Good evening. My name is Roman, and I am writing to you from the city of Quitilipi, a province of Chaco, Argentina. I am currently 17 years old, but what I'm about to tell you happened when I was 15. Believe me, to this day, it has been the worst experience of my short life. It all started when my aunt, my mom, and I decided to go visit my grandparents, whom we had not seen for a long time. They lived in a small town in the middle of the countryside further south. It was about a 12-hour drive from our house to theirs. We really lived far away. In recent days, my mother had just broken her arm when she fell from the roof of our house. She was lucky. It could have been worse. Taking advantage of the fact that she was on disability, we decided to take a trip. We took my aunt's car and she decided to drive. During the long trip, I was sitting in the back seat of the car, enjoying the beautiful scenery. Shortly before we reached our destination, we passed through the fields belonging to the village where my grandparents lived. It was then when I saw something really creepy. In the middle of the fields, I saw a woman who seemed to be floating. She was wearing a dirty gray and black dress, and her long black hair completely covered her face. I was so shocked that I closed my eyes and shook my head. When I looked again, the woman was gone. To be honest, I did feel a little scared, but my curiosity was much greater. I told my aunt to stop the car. I had to get out. She thought I was feeling sick or that I had to pee, so she pulled over. I got out of the car, walked back a few feet to look for the woman I had just seen. But again, she was nowhere to be found. When I got back to the car, my aunt asked me what was wrong, and I told her I had just seen a strange woman in the field. But what was strange to me was that she seemed to be floating. She and my mother laughed at me, saying that I was just imagining things because I was already tired. We continued on our way, and although I kept thinking about what I saw, I didn't talk about it again. Luckily, it was only a short time before we finally finished our long trip. It was already getting dark when we finally arrived at my grandparents' house. It was a very emotional reunion. They were already waiting for us as we had told them in advance of our visit. My grandparents came out of the house as soon as they heard the car, hugged us, and showered us with kisses. The truth is that we had missed each other a lot. My mother suggested that we pull out some chairs and talk outside while enjoying the nice weather, but the sun was already setting. That's when my grandmother said it would be best if we went inside the house. I didn't understand it at the time, since my grandmother was always the one with the idea of being outside to enjoy the weather. But oh well. I didn't think it was worth asking, and we stayed in the living room, talking about everything that had happened during all these years. After several hours of talking and well into the night, something pretty creepy happened outside. In the distance, we heard the loud and long cry of a woman. We all became quiet, for that scream was so horrible that it made the hair on the back of our necks stand on end. It was heard in a way that was diabolical. It is a scream that is very difficult to describe, but what I can assure you is that no normal human being can scream like that. We stood with our eyes wide open, looking at each other, realizing that we had all heard the same thing. I also know that it came from far away and that it was heard all over town because all the dogs around us started barking. Seriously, it still makes my skin crawl. My aunt, visibly frightened, said that was a very bad thing. Then, my grandparents suggested that the best thing to do was to go to our room and rest, since we were probably exhausted from the trip. Although that scream scared away all the tiredness we had, we thought it was a good idea to go to sleep. My aunt, my mother, and I stayed in the same room. my mother and I in one bed and my aunt in the other. We turned off the light and talked about that terrible scream we had all heard. And to be honest, it was really scary. A few minutes later, just as sleep was beginning to settle in, we heard the same terrifying and chilling scream once again. But this time, it was much longer, like a wail. And the worst thing is that it was heard much closer. We felt that scream down to our bones. Truly, it is an indescribable sensation. The dogs howled and barked. My greatest fear was not knowing what it was about and that it could be heard a lot closer. That scream was definitely not human. The three of us started praying, and thankfully we didn't hear it again. The dogs continued barking for much longer until gradually everything became absolutely silent. Our original plan was to stay in the town for several days. The main purpose was, of course, to visit my grandparents and, during the day, to go for walks to various places for my aunt and mother to visit the places where they grew up. They always liked to do that every time we went to see my grandparents. But after hearing that, we didn't want to spend another night there. The next morning, we realized that everywhere we went, people were talking about that woman's scream. It seemed that everyone in town, and even the surrounding communities, had also heard her. Everyone said it was the ghost of Camila. Everyone was terrified when they heard her screaming and wailing at night. According to what we learned, this was not the first time this had happened. That same afternoon, we told my grandmother what everyone was saying, and to our surprise, she showed no sign of surprise. She didn't deny it, and in fact told us what she knew about it. She told us that those horrible wailings were from a soul in pain that had been haunting the town, the fields, and the nearby hills for a while now. But the most chilling thing was that it was the soul of a woman that everyone knew, at least by sight. She was a neighbor there, and indeed, her name was Camila. She was unalived by her own husband to keep all the wealth they were accumulating. But not satisfied with his cruelty, he did not allow her funeral to take place, and he himself buried the body somewhere in the hills. No one, not even her own family, knew exactly where. That was one of the reasons why she could not rest in peace. My grandmother told us that they had been hearing her for several nights now, listening to her terrible wailing, and they didn't know what to do about it. Her relatives had been searching tirelessly for her body, but they couldn't find her. Also, no one knew anything about her husband. Everyone said that he ran away from town with all the money and other riches. From the moment my grandmother told us this story, our stay in that place was no longer the same. Now, we were all afraid. The peacefulness of the town was gone, and being in that place was no longer pleasant. Especially because that second night, we also heard the screams of that woman through the streets of that town. Since we were all scared because of what we already knew, we went to bed earlier in order to be asleep during the night and not to hear anything. But it didn't work at all, for all of us in that house were awakened by the wailing of that soul in pain. In fact, that night we heard it 3 times. Every time she screamed, I would get the chills, because not only could you hear her, somehow you could feel her too. Seriously, it was indescribably scary. And hearing all the dogs barking and howling in terror made everything truly terrifying. The next morning, we talked about it with my grandmother, and she said that this spooky event was becoming a nightly thing. However, not many in town could get used to it. My grandparents said they would never leave town and never leave everything behind just because of what was happening. But my aunt and my mom talked to them about how good it would be if they moved with us to the city. That the years were flying by and it would do us all a lot of good to be more united and to take care of each other. Besides, my grandfather, although he is a strong man, built on farming activities, was already getting old, and it would also be wise for him to consider taking a break. All this was a very difficult subject to talk about with them. We realized that it would not be easy to convince them, but because of what was happening, my aunt, my mother, and I wanted to leave. We spent one more day in town, and along with it came the third night, which, by the way, was the most horrible for the three of us. That night, I woke up very thirsty, so I got up and went straight to the kitchen. I was pouring myself a glass of water when, suddenly, my worst fear happened. That horrible scream was heard in the street, but this time, it was too close to us. I couldn't help but to be curious enough to look out the window that faces the street, and that's when I realized what a terrible mistake I had made. For that's when I saw her. There she was, just a few feet away from the house. Seeing it with my own eyes provokes a deep terror in me, and it is that to be in front of a manifestation that you know well that it is a specter, a dead person, a being from another world, is a very horrible experience that you never forget. However, I realized that it was not the first time I had seen her, for it was exactly the same woman, the same one I had seen floating over the fields when we were on our way to town. It was her. I couldn't be wrong. That woman was coming towards us. I froze for a few seconds, but then I ran into the room, terrified. By that time, my mother was already coming to get me. At that moment, my grandmother opened the door and came into the room. She told us to go to hers since it was the room farthest from the street. That ghost was outside, crying, screaming and wailing in a very horrible way. My grandmother began to pray and told us to join in prayer. After several minutes, the woman's screaming stopped, and all we could hear were the dogs from all around us, barking and howling. My aunt said that it was all too strange because no person grieves in that way, no matter how much evil they had done in life. And even after being unalived and buried in an unholy place, she said that it was not a simple ghost. It had to be something else, another kind of entity condemned to wander this world in that way. She asked my grandmother if the town priest couldn't do something about it, to put an end to those manifestations. Maybe organize a series of masses or something to bless her rest, even if her body wasn't buried in a holy place. But it was then that my grandmother said something that left us speechless, for what she had told us before was not the whole truth. Unfortunately, that woman needed more than the blessing of a priest. It could almost be said that she needed God's forgiveness directly, without intercessors. It turns out that everyone in town was sure that this woman had made a pact with the devil, because from one day to the next, she began to obtain money and wealth in a surprising way for no reason at all. Before that, Camila and her husband were very poor, and it was said that in desperation, she decided to sell her soul to the devil in exchange for a life full of wealth, which she boasted about until her last days. Unfortunately, all that ill-gotten fortune brought more misfortune than joy, as it sparked greed and strife with her husband. So he, seeking to get rid of her and keep all the money for himself, ended his wife's life in a cruel and ruthless way and hid the body to hide the evidence. Now, that woman cannot rest in peace because her remains do not rest in a holy place, but above all, because her soul no longer belongs to God. However, the devil had not yet taken her away, and she was stuck in this world, wandering and mourning her misfortune, submerged in a horrible torment that we did not know when it would end. Since then, the nights in that town became very, very frightening. No one rests, and it is no longer the peaceful place it used to be. For many people, that was already an unbearable situation. Even my grandparents couldn't stand being there anymore, but they didn't say so because, according to them, they didn't want to worry us. We talked about it and decided to wait for them for a few more days while they fixed all their things. Fortunately, we managed to convince them, and since then, my grandparents have been living with us in Quitilipi. It has been 2 years since all this happened, and according to what the people of the town tell us, the manifestations of that woman continued for 2 more months until suddenly, one night, she was no longer to be seen or heard in the streets. Everyone says that the devil finally came for her. But peace has not yet completely returned to that town, as they say that some nights they can still hear her in the distance in the early mornings. My grandparents settled in the city and live very comfortably. I don't think they will return to town anymore, and of course, we are the happiest that they have decided to do so. Even so, we hope that peace will return to their town. We hope so for all our friends and other people who had to stay there because they have no possibility to leave that place. And although I consider it unlikely, I also hope that the woman has been forgiven and that her soul is finally resting in peace. If you enjoyed this story, please like and subscribe.